Hello. Hello.
Good morning, Mr. Brand. Thank you.
Good morning.
Please have a seat. Mr. Brand, Mr. Summers, thank you for giving evidence to the committee's inquiry into drugs. Mr. Russell Brand, you gave evidence, written evidence to this committee, which members of the committee have read. Could I start with a point about what you say in your evidence, that you disagree with the legalisation of drugs because you think that a deterrent effect is necessary? Is that right?
I don't feel entirely qualified to talk about legislation. For me, what's more significant is the way that we socially regard the condition of addiction. It's something that I consider to be an illness and therefore more a health matter than a criminal or judicial matter. I don't think that legalisation is something that I've, as I said, particularly qualified to get into. I can see areas, in fact, where decriminalisation might be considered useful and more efficient. You know, in like countries like Portugal or Switzerland, where there's been trials, it seems to have had some efficacy. But for me, it's more important that we regard people suffering from addiction with compassion, and that there's a pragmatic rather than symbolic approach to treating it. And I think the legislative status of addiction and the criminalisation of addicts is kind of symbolic and not really functional. I don't see how it especially helps. But I'm not saying let's have a wacky free-for-all where people go around taking drugs. Didn't help me much.
You're a former heroin addict.
Yeah.
Briefly, could you tell us how you got onto drugs and then how you managed to come off it and how many years you were on hard drugs?
I see you've incorporated the word briefly now into the question, as you've already noticed my propensity for verbosity. I became a drug addict, I think, because of emotional difficulties, psychological difficulties, and perhaps a spiritual malady. For me, taking drugs and excessive drinking were the result of a psychological, spiritual, or mental condition. So they're symptomatic. I was like sad, lonely, unhappy, detached, and drugs and alcohol for me seemed like a solution to that problem. Once I dealt with the emotional, spiritual, mental impetus, I no longer felt the need to take drugs or use drugs. I got clean actually at Chip Summers' facility, Focus 12, which is abstinence-based recovery. And that's what we essentially believe in, is that if you have the disease or the illness of addiction or alcoholism, the best way to tackle it is to not use drugs in any form, whether it's state-sponsored opiates like methadone, or illegal street drugs, or illegal substance like alcohol. We see no distinction between these substances. What we believe in is that abstinence-based recovery is the best solution for people suffering from this condition, and the support structures exist to get people to maintain recovery, abstinence-based recovery. What we want is more research and funding into abstinence-based recovery, and to be able to filter people towards this new lifestyle, which actually criminalisation becomes less of an issue, in my view, because it takes people that have to indulge in criminal activity to fund their habits and gets them into being valuable members of society.
Now,
was that brief enough?
Very brief, thank you. You were arrested roughly 12 times.
By yes,
by the police and the justice system. Mm-hmm. Do you think that when you were arrested that you had the kind of support that you needed, and people like you who were arrested being involved in drugs, the rehabilitation and the support that was needed to get you off drugs? How did the criminal justice system react to you after your arrests?
From my experience speaking to people in the criminal justice system, and from my own personal experience being arrested, there's some confusion and ignorance around addiction, and it's quite understandable because a lot of drug addicts, like speaking personally, are antisocial. They are a strain on society. They necessarily engage in criminal activity. They're a public nuisance in many ways. I felt when I was arrested that the police were doing a necessary job of enforcing the laws of this country, and they were doing what they had to do. But it wasn't until I had access to abstinence-based recovery that I was able to change my behaviour and significantly reduce, all but obliterate, my criminal activity, apart from the occasional skirmish.
Final question from me on this section. is the issue of legal highs. We've been very concerned in the evidence that we've received about the number of legal highs that are available and young people who seem to be able to take legal highs. Whenever they are banned or proposed to be banned, a new legal high emerges. Do you think that this is something that does affect young people? Is this now the drug of choice for young people?
I don't know because I'm not young enough anymore, but I know that young people will always want to get high, and I think that what we need is a pragmatic approach to this. In a way, for me, as I said before, Keith, it's insignificant the substance that they're using, whether it's alcohol, illegal street drugs. The legal status of a drug is irrelevant to a drug addict. If you're a drug addict, you're getting drugs. That's it. You're going to get them. So, it's, in a way, it's probably best to make it simple. As for legal highs, what I think we need to do is address the social, mental and spiritual problems that are leading young people or people of all ages to taking drugs. And so I think what we need is research into abstinence-based recovery and more awareness around it.
On to some of those points with other questions. Bridget Phillipson.
Chair. We're currently working on a programme about addiction and how it's viewed in society. What messages are you hoping to get across in that programme?
The messages that we're hoping to get across in this programme is that maintenance of drug addiction through state-sponsored substances like methadone should only be deployed as part of a reduction with the ultimate aim of abstinence-based recovery. That we need to start regarding addiction in all its forms as a health issue as opposed to a judicial and criminal issue. That we need to change the laws in this country and we need to have a more compassionate, altruistic, loving attitude to the people with the disease of addiction and recognise that these people with the proper help, access to the proper treatment, can become active and helpful members of society, like myself, some would argue that point, or perhaps more obviously Chip Summers, who, a man with a criminal record as long as your arm, now runs a treatment centre and has been clean for 27 years. That's the message, that we don't want to discard people, we don't want to life them off on methadone and leave them on the sidelines. We need to bring them in to society, offer them treatment and once again neutralise the toxic social threat that they offer as criminals because they have to fund their habit, or even if it's a legal drug like alcohol, they're clattering into things, driving drunk, pain in the arse people. We need to offer them treatment and activate them and incorporate them into our society. So the message is ultimately one of pragmatism, altruism and compassion in all areas of the condition.
Thank you. Mr. Summers, we will have specific questions for you, but if you want to chip in, if I may put it like that, at any stage, please feel free to do so, but we do have... Is there anything you want to add from what you've heard so far?
Splendidly.
Thanks, Chip. Chip runs the treatment centre where I got clean. So
yes, we're coming on to him in a minute, Mr. Brand.
He's already the puppeteer behind each and every articulation.
Thank you, Mr. Brand. Michael Ellis has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brand, you've said that addiction is an illness.
Yes.
But would you say that it's also fair to characterise it to a large extent as self-induced?
Not really.
Like many other illnesses, and also that it does carry with it victims. Many people who are on drugs commit offences against other people, do they not? So it differs in that respect as well, doesn't it? When one's looking at the criminal justice system, doesn't one also have to have some compassion and consideration for the victims of crime where those crimes are committed by people under the influence of drugs?
Michael, I'm very glad you've asked me that question. It's a very important question. It's one that we need to address. Of course, the victims of acquisitive drug-related crimes are important and need to be taken care of. We were with Chief Superintendent Graham Bartlett the other day of Sussex Police, a wonderful man, a good civic-minded gentleman. It's his belief that by regarding addiction as an illness, by offering treatment instead of a more punitive approach, we can prevent people from committing crimes. Just personally, I was a criminal when I was a drug addict by virtue of my addiction and the ways that I had to acquire money to get drugs. Anecdotally, Chip was an armed robber in and out of Nick all the time. I hope you don't mind me telling them this. And other people I've met, criminality is a necessary component. Now, of course, we're not saying forget the victims, but I'm saying it's better to address the social situation pragmatically. And I think we all know this. By prescribing methadone to people, most people on methadone are using illegal drugs to supplement their habit. They're not addressing the root problems. We need to approach the victims with respect. Where there has been criminal behaviour, it needs to be dealt with correctly. But perhaps within the penal system itself, we can offer treatment to addicts, like the brilliant work that's done by RAPT in various institutions and prisons.
So you'd say there needs to be carrot and stick, would you?
I don't think there needs to be a carrot or a stick. Both of those things seem like bizarre metaphors. I think what there needs to be is love and compassion to everybody involved. You need to, if people are committing criminal behaviour, then it needs to be dealt with legally, but you need to offer them treatment, not simply out of some airy-fairy that's all old hands and hug liberalism, but because it deals with the problem and it prevents further crimes being committed. Addicts that get clean at one day at a time through abstinence-based recovery, generally speaking, stop committing crimes. That's better for victims, it's better for the addict, it's better for society.
Ellis?
The role that celebrities play in society is not insignificant. I want to ask you whether...
I'd argue that it is insignificant, and that's why they play that role.
Perhaps it should be more than it is, but what I want to know from you, Mr. Brand, is whether you think that having got out of the cycle of addiction,
yes,
and I congratulate you for that.
Thank you.
Whether you would like to position yourself as a role model in society for those who might look to you as an example.
As the great Tupac Shakur said, role is something people play, model is something that people make. Both of those things are fake. What I want to offer people is truth and authenticity in the treatment of this illness, in our regard to the criminal components of it, in assisting victims, and in the way we legislate and organise our society. I can't be responsible, as you know, you lot hold committees all the time about the reprehensible behaviour of our media. What the cipher of my image is used to represent in the media, I have no control over.
You do, because your behaviour is some aspect of what's portrayed about you, isn't it?
Well, yes, of course, but however, how's this going to be written up? This could be written up as Michael Ellis, he's sprawled on a pin there by the wit of Brand, or they could say the recalcitrant former drug addict rambled on. If you read it in the Telegraph, it's going to say one thing. If you read it in the Socialist Worker, it's going to say another thing.
Combination.
Of course, the objective behaviour has got components, but I'm saying that what I want to offer people is truth and authenticity, and I think celebrity, as we all know, is a vapid, vacuous, toxic concept used to distract people from what's actually important, and in this case that's treatment of people with a disease of addiction.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Summers.
As far as we were concerned, those people who are brave enough, who are both celebrities and recovering addicts, have a profound effect on the number of people who seek treatment, because it gives out a very positive message that recovery is possible. And when Russell Brand's book came out, the number of referrals to our treatment centre was just hugely exaggerated, because people suddenly discovered that treatment was possible, help was possible, and it was better, and people could get better, and it made a profound difference. And I would hope that actually more people in the public eye, whether they be, I suppose by celebrities they are in the public eye, will come forward and have the bravery to do so, because it does encourage people.
So celebrities can be a very positive role.
Absolutely. But of course then it can backfire as well when people make a big fuss about being in recovery and then relapse, and of course that's unfortunate, but we're fortunate with Russell that he's maintaining a good recovery, and that continues to be a good role model.
Brand, do you think more people need to know about things like cocaine production, where cocaine comes from? The committee went to Colombia to look at the effects that the harvesting of cocaine was having on the people of Colombia, who are extraordinarily poor and were forced to be involved in this kind of activity. Do you think if there was more focus on where it all came from and how it affected the communities, that would help stop people getting involved?
No, Keith, no more than the industrial consequences of oil production affect people using their cars. People don't care about industry, people care about getting the resource that they require. The illegality makes no difference, the consequences in the nation of origin makes no difference. I think what we need is to address the emotional, mental and spiritual problems that lead to addiction. Of course, any illegal industry or the cocaine manufacture in South American nations or wherever has a negative consequence for their nations, but I don't think that that's something that individual drug addicts are going to be affected by, to be honest, because they're normally on drugs.
Thank you very much. Lorraine Fulbrook has some questions to Mr. Summers.
I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Summers. Focus 12 has 3 high-profile patrons, Mr.
Yes.
Brand, Davina McCall
Yeah.
and
Boy
George. And that's something that was probably unthinkable about 50 years ago.
Yes.
Do you think that has led to the destigmatisation of addiction, or do you think it's led to a wider acceptance of drug use in society in general?
I don't think it's encouraged people to use drugs. I think there have been some people who have made a sort of positive...
Sorry, Len.
I was right in the middle of my answer then.
Still a good speech, it's just got some ladies going by.
I think that the public is fine. Yes, Mr.
Okay.
Summers.
Yeah, I've completely forgotten where I was.
Because you was flirting with
It's about high-profile patrons
Oh, yeah.
and destigmatisation, or does it?
I
lead
think there are
to
certain
wider
celebrities who have made a sort of positive message about drug use, which has not helped the situation at all. I think most people who get better from drug addiction are a very positive influence. But I think there are some celebrities, obviously, who have probably contributed to people using drugs because they make it look glamorous, they make it look interesting, and I don't suppose that helps. But I think as long as, you see, while they're using, they will tend to do that. But if they stop using, then they obviously become a very positive role model. But I do think there are some celebrities who have made the matter worse. I don't think on a national scale it's made a huge difference. I think there are one or two people who are influenced by that. But I don't think it's...
As the chief executive of Focus, I mean,
Yeah.
how do you pick your celebrities, as it were?
the ones that get clean, I'll grab them.
Very helpful. Nicola Blackwood.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate you on your work on abstinence-based work. I think that it's very effective, and I share your suspicion about long-term methadone maintenance. But I was struck by your comments about the problems of highlighting drug use in communities. And do you think that we're doing enough, or do you think that there's a risk that our harm reduction based approaches to drugs education are giving a false impression that there are some drugs which are safe if they're used correctly?
I think we are not doing anything like enough to give an honest answer to the problems of drugs. I think we are giving a rather clouded message about drug use. I think there's a lot more that we could be doing about honestly educating people about drugs. I don't think we address it and take it on board properly enough. And I feel that we should be doing much more, especially at an educational level. We should be giving honest education, and I don't think there are many schools that are giving honest education to young people. We've been educating young people now for 15 years, and it hasn't had a major influence on the number of drug use. I think we need to change how we're doing the education of young people, particularly.
Well, how? Because
by giving more honest information. It's no good just going into schools and saying drugs are bad, stop it. Because in each of those schools there will be people who are using cannabis, who are using ketamine, or using ecstasy. Not all the school, but some of them will be. And if you don't give people both the good and the bad of drug use, they won't listen to you. Because there are lots of people in schools who are smoking cannabis and not dropping dead. You have to give both the positive and the negative side of it. And I don't think we're doing that. I think we're giving too much of the negative side of it and not giving honest information. Unless it's honest, people won't listen.
Thank you. Dr. Julian Huppert wants to...
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Summers, you're an advocate for abstinence-based
Very much so.
approaches. You presumably know there's been work by Professor Strang, for example, published in The Lancet, which showed that there was good evidence for methadone maintenance and very high cost effectiveness, fairly good for heroin maintenance, and a lack of evidence for abstinence. Do you think that abstinence is the answer for everybody, or are you arguing that there are people for whom it is a very good option?
I think it is an admirable aim for everybody. Not everybody can achieve it. Not everybody can give up smoking. But I think it is. I think there's a really good purpose for methadone usage at a certain stage. But just to park people on methadone for 4 to 7 years and more is criminal, really. I mean, just to keep people locked into that addiction, because methadone usage is a dependency. You're totally dependent. I think it has a role, but I think it gets overused, and I think we just tend to use it as a response to everything, and we don't do enough to intervene. I think it would be an admirable aim for everybody. I don't think methadone usage is a good thing. I see very few people on methadone who are leading good, stable lives. I think most of the people who are using methadone are also using other drugs on top. If I saw it producing good stability, I would be much more in favour of it. I don't see that. What I do see is that people who are abstinent lead good, clean and decent lives, but obviously not everybody can achieve it.
I think that suggests further research is needed to check the results. Can I also just ask, really, for both of you, because obviously we have finite resources to spend. If we're going to spend more money on treatment, if we're going to spend more money on education, money has to be taken from somewhere. I mean, one possible suggestion is that we spend less money on doing the policing of possession, for example. Yeah. Is that something which you would support, or would you see things in a different way?
I think that's a brilliant idea, as a matter of fact, and I think that there's people within the criminal justice services that share that view. I think that, you've got to appropriate these resources from somewhere, and there's already been brought up, mate, in here. It's like that. It's not penalising people for the possession of drugs is costly and expensive. A good number of the times I was arrested was simply for possession, and the administrative costs of that would be better spent, I think, on education and addressing and treatment. I think that would be a very, very sensible use of those redirected funds.
Mr. Summers?
Mr. Summers?
I feel like I'm at school now because I've forgotten the question.
Like, do you think instead of nicking people for possession,
they
should just stick it into treatment and education?
Thank you for that translation, Mr. Bryant. Mr. Summers?
I think there's an awful lot of money wasted on small-time possession of small amounts of drugs, which are just part and parcel of the daily hustle and bustle of using. I think there is an awful lot of police time wasted on that, and I'm not saying that we should legalise it, but I think if we could get rid of some of that, because that sort of just minor possession is just part of the everyday life of being an addict. And, it would be... I certainly think there's a massive difference between decriminalising and legalising. I think it's good to treat it as a health issue rather than a criminal issue, but I'm not in favour of legalising things. But I think we do waste a lot of money, unfortunately, on minor.
You spent quite a lot of time in prison on accounts of possession.
Yes, I did.
Also armed robbery to get drugs.
I think Nicola
so
Blackwood
should we even trust you?
Mr. Brown, I think Nicola Blackwood has a quick supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. There's quite a gap between education and full-blown addiction and treatment for abstinence. And in that gap, you have first use and so on. And what you need is intervention during that period to prevent addiction and sort of prevention. And some of that prevention is perhaps first arrest for prevention and diversion programmes. Are you suggesting that we should be removing all spending on those intermediate steps in drugs policy?
No, I think we should do it better.
Okay.
Thank you. Chairman, I'd like to ask both the gentlemen, what are your views on decriminalisation or legalisation of drugs?
Chip's already been pretty clear on the subject. I'm not a legal expert. I'm saying that it's, to a drug addict, the legal status is irrelevant. It's at best an inconvenience. If you need to get drugs because you're a drug addict, you're going to get drugs regardless of their legal status. So the more money you waste in administering and controlling that, I think there's a futility.
So would you be in favour or not?
Yeah, I think, to tell you the truth, yes, I would. I think that there's a degree of cowardice and sort of willful ignorance around this condition. I think a good many people here, like if you think about it, like sort of we all know someone who's affected by alcoholism or addiction, and it's something that we increasingly need to handle compassionately and pragmatically. The criminal and legal status, I think, sends the wrong message. But I wouldn't start banging a drum, as I said before, to make drugs legal, because I don't take any drugs and I don't drink because for me they're bad. I just think we need to recognise the distinction that certain people have a condition or a tendency that drugs and alcohol are going to ruin their lives. We need to identify those people and offer them the correct treatment.
Thank you.
So,
Mr. Summers,
Mr. Summers,
do you
yes.
agree with decriminalisation or legislation?
I think there's a real argument for decriminalising it so that it gets treated like a health issue rather than a legal issue. However, I think there's a massive difference between that and legalising drugs. I think you really find it very difficult to justify the legal use of a lot of drugs. You can't really justify the legal use of heroin, crack cocaine, or any of those drugs. There's no medical or legal reason why people should be able to use those drugs. So I think you would be hard-pressed to... I think that cannabis is probably the one you could make an argument for.
But you wouldn't support the legalisation of cannabis?
I think it's the one that is most likely to be... the one that you've got a chance of kind of actually sort of putting forward an argument of justification. I don't think there's any justification for the legalisation.
Yes, of course. Lorraine Faulkner has another.
But if you legalise or decriminalise cannabis, you're not taking away the problem. We've seen the other end where there is a serious and organised crime issue and the narco-terrorism issue, which ruins people's lives. I mean, murders people, it causes conflict in countries.
I'm not advocating the legalisation of cannabis. I'm just saying if there was any drug at all that you could put forward an argument for legal, cannabis is the one you've got the best chance with. But there's no... How on earth do you justify the usage of heroin or crack cocaine or anything like
But
that.
making it illegal is not working anyway, Chip. So it's not like, you know, I just think that there needs to be honesty and authenticity around this issue so that people in Parliament don't look like they're out of touch. So I think it's really good that you're holding this committee, but some of this information is already accessible.
Thank you. Final question from Mr. Ellis.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, I think you both referred to a preference for ignoring what you described as the more minor offending in relation to drugs. Can I suggest to you that a lot of the more minor offending leads to some of the more major offending, and that actually what one is doing if one is to ignore those types of offences would be to make the matter worse, both for society who is suffering under the increased levels of crime, but also for the offender who would be less likely to learn the lessons of having been arrested and be more likely to get worse.
Arresting, let me just interrupt for a bit, because otherwise it's like they're telling us what to do. Being arrested isn't a lesson, it's just an administrative blip. You need to demonstrate an awareness of the situation. Yes, of course, in many ways the disease or the condition of addiction does exacerbate, and if you start taking drugs it's likely you'll take worse drugs, and if you're taking expensive drugs you will end up committing crime. But again, mate, what we need to identify is a degree of authenticity and compassion in the way we deal with this problem. Otherwise you just seem like you don't know what you're talking about.
Crime.
We've talked about them. You can tell what party they're in from their questions, innit?
What about the victims of the crime? I think all parties are interested in victims of crime.
Of course we are. That's what we're saying. We're not saying that they ignore victims.
I think we're running out of time. I have a final question about...
Time is infinite.
Unfortunately,
we cannot run out of time.
It is, but for this committee...
Who's next? Theresa May? She may not show up. Check she knows what day it is.
Mr. Brand, I have a final question for you.
It's not quite a variety show, Mr. Brand.
You're providing a little bit of variety, though.
Mr. Brand, you have...
Making it more like Dad's Army.
Mr. Brand, you have 4.5 million Twitter followers.
Oh, yes.
And 1.5 million Facebook followers. Having gone through addiction and then rehabilitation, what is your message to young people who want to get involved in drugs? What would you say to them about the effects that it has?
My message isn't for young people. My message is for people that have this condition of addiction. If you have the condition of addiction, there is help available for you, and I recommend abstinence-based recovery. I think some people can safely take drugs. I think they can, as long as it doesn't turn them into criminals or harm their health. Then I don't feel like it's any of my business. You know, so I'm not here to do some Just Say No stuff. The kids that sung that Just Say No were all taking drugs in the White House when they were visiting Nancy Reagan. It's a further demonstration of the disjunct between reality and authenticity. Let's have an authentic, truthful, honest debate and some funding for abstinence-based recovery.
Mr. Summers, do you have anything to add to that? With the work, the excellent work you're doing in your charity?
I tend to deal with I get very muddled in all the kind of legalisation, decriminalisation. What I tend to do is deal with the problem when it exists, and I agree completely that when those people come into treatment, they have damaged a lot of people in the public. They are harming at least 4 or 5 other people in their families who are significantly distressed by that behaviour, and I try and prevent that. And I think the best way of preventing that in a long-term basis is ultimately abstinence treatment. I think that's when you stop causing harm to families, stop causing harm to the public, and that's your best chance, because at the moment I see people who are not in abstinence programmes still continuing to cause distress to families and the public.
Mr. Summers, Mr. Brown, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And thank you for your written evidence.
Thank you.
Order, could we have our next witnesses, please? Thank you very much.
Cheers.